Season 4 will be released on April 19th, and like every diehard fan out there, I decided to rewatch the show to prepare myself for the upcoming season. Here's something about me that I don't think many people know. I've been analyzing TV series for about 2 years now, and I recently decided to create my own channel. This is how Scene by Scene was born. So far, I've only analyzed Stranger Things on this channel, but I can proudly say that I managed to guess the plot behind Vecna's plan. I watched From last year and finished all 3 seasons in just 1 week. I also read everything I could find about the lore and the theories across the internet. I'm saying this to show that I started this rewatch with a pretty solid base of knowledge, even if that knowledge was a little dusty. While rewatching the show, I noted down every detail I found interesting or potentially significant to the plot. So, in today's video, this is exactly what I'm going to share with you. All the notes I wrote during my rewatch. This video won't be a typical analysis or recap, but rather one filled with questions and remarks that I found odd during my watch. The goal of this video is to spark discussion, and by doing that, we might get closer to discovering what that town really is. So, let's get started. The first thing I noticed is that after Sarah killed Jade's friends, she opened the door to make it look like the monsters were the real killers. She did that because the voices told her she wouldn't get caught if she did. But here's the interesting part. Sarah left the clinic in the middle of the night and safely made it home. Did the voices protect her from the monsters? Do the monsters even attack her? We saw Elgin listening to the voices, assuming that the kimono lady is one of them, and Smiley was reborn. So could the voices protect Sarah in some way? Maybe Sarah being with Boyd in the woods is the reason why the tent was only moved to another part of the forest. Moving forward, the next thing that caught my attention is a line from Ethan after he wakes up from his leg operation in the RV. Ethan says, "I saw the Lake of Tears. It was a drawing on the wall, and we were all there in the drawings. But somebody screamed because a spider came down from the ceiling." On the first watch, this line might go unnoticed, but on a second rewatch, it holds much more meaning. We saw Boyd and Sarah arriving in a part of the forest filled with spider webs, and from those webs, the ghost of Abby emerged to haunt Boyd. So, could this be confirmation that the ultimate villain of the series is a spider and not the man in yellow? I've always had a hunch that the man in yellow is not the final boss, but rather the second most dangerous entity out there. I'm assuming that the most terrifying monster wouldn't waste time speaking with Jim through the radio. That feels more like something the management would do, which is why I believe the man in yellow is the one who interferes when things start going too well. Another interesting thing Ethan says is in episode 4. When Jim and Ethan arrive at the diner, Ethan asks Jim if they're going to live there now. Jim responds that they're not and that he should think of it as a vacation. Then Ethan says something very interesting. "I think it's more like a quest. We probably have to save somebody if we want to go home." On the first watch, this line feels like a typical trope. A hero's quest tied to defeating a big scary monster and saving people. But now, knowing about the children and how Jade and Tabitha might be reincarnations brought back to save them, this line feels far more specific. If you're up to date with popular fan theories, you might have heard the one suggesting that Ethan is the reincarnation of the man in yellow, because he wears yellow in many scenes. After rewatching the show, I can actually see why people believe this. But while paying close attention to what the characters wear, I noticed another pattern. Jim often seems to wear blue. Blue and yellow are considered opposite colors, so could the writers have intentionally dressed them this way to show an opposition between the two? Maybe this is why Jim becomes the first person killed by the man in yellow, because he represents the biggest threat, the one closest to solving the mystery. When I first watched the show, Jim really annoyed me. I couldn't stand him at times, to be honest. But on my second rewatch, my perspective changed completely, and I could understand where all his actions were coming from. I can't say the same about Tabitha. Her performance felt weak to me. I'm not sure if that was due to the writing or the acting, but I even wrote a rant about her while rewatching the show. But going back to Jim, he asked some of the most insightful questions in the series. For me, he's on par with Jade, maybe even better because while Jade has a connection to the town, Jim has to figure everything out from scratch. He built the radio, and he was the one who discovered that the numbers were actually part of a song. When you think about it, it makes sense that the man in yellow would want Jim dead. So could this have been foreshadowed by the colors they wear? Another thing I noticed related to color is this. The show clearly emphasizes colors. We have the man in yellow and the boy in white. Thinking again about Jim wearing blue, I realized something. We have yellow, we have blue, but we're missing red, the third primary color. So what could red represent? The only clear connection we have is the red creature in the drawings inside the tunnels that Victor and Tabitha saw. This red entity could potentially be the true ultimate villain of the story. I really feel like this color connection is more important than people realize, and not many are talking about it. I also noticed how the boy in white only appears when two cars arrive in town and things are about to turn really bad. I think it's common knowledge by now that everything that happens in From is part of a story and is more or less connected to Ethan's Chromonocle story. In episode 6, when Tabitha and Ethan go to the storage room for the first time, Ethan says, "It's like the cavern of the lonely dragon. When the Chromonocle was lost in the rainbow sky, she found a cavern where the lonely dragon lived, full of stuff that nobody wanted. But for the lonely dragon, all that stuff is treasure. And guess what? In one of the big piles of stuff, there was a map of the rainbow sky. So the lonely dragon gave it to the Chromonocle, and then she wasn't lost anymore. So maybe we can find a map over here." As you might have noticed, Ethan's insights are always revealing. However, they didn't find a map. Tabitha found the bracelet he made for Jim. But here's the interesting part. What if Ethan was actually right? What if there really was a map hidden there? And that map is Christopher's journal. When Jade became obsessed with the symbol and kept drawing it everywhere, Tianchen saw him drawing it at the diner and went to the storage room to retrieve Christopher's journal, which contained the same symbol. If you don't remember, Christopher was Jade's previous reincarnation, the man with the puppet. Tianchen and her family were Chinese immigrants, and China is deeply associated with dragons. The lonely dragon fits Tianchen perfectly. She lost her husband, and we see her grieving every night, emphasizing how lonely she is. She also knew the storage room inside out, which reflects how the dragon in Ethan's story treasured what others saw as useless. So Tianchen giving Christopher's journal to Jade perfectly mirrors Ethan's story of how the lonely dragon gave the Chromonocle the map of the rainbow sky. Also in the scene where Tianchen picks up the box with Christopher's belongings, it looks like there is also a radio. Could this mean that Christopher tried to do the same thing with the radio as Jade did? Since they are reincarnations of one another, it would make sense for them to attempt similar solutions. Next, we have Father Khatri telling Sarah, "What if we are living the book that is written?" I think this line is interesting for multiple reasons. First of all, we already suspect that this is a story, but we also have hints that the story might already be finished. The man in yellow saying that this next part is my favorite, along with the repeating cycle of Jade and Tabitha, suggests that the book has already been written. Secondly, what if the voices Sarah hears are actually telling the truth? The voices are real. They know things no one else does. There's no denying that. Sarah's first victim was Jade's friend, and when he arrived at the clinic, we saw him holding a bandage over his eye. I immediately associated this with the visions Jade had of a man with a missing eye. However, I dismissed this theory when I saw that his eye was completely fine the next day. But what if Toby really was the reincarnation of the person haunting Jade, and the voices told Sarah to kill him because he would become a threat? After seeing how Season 3 ended, and knowing that in Season 4 Elgin will have a bandage over his eye, we can assume that Elgin is the reincarnation of that same figure. We also saw that when Jade had a vision while Christy was caught in the bear trap, the ghost was holding a crane filled with blood and drinking from it. This could connect to how Elgin used his blood to feed Fatima. So, if my initial assumption was correct, that Toby was the reincarnation of the one-eyed figure, then the voices may have been justified in telling Sarah to kill him. We saw that Toby's replacement, Elgin, ended up helping the kimono lady by kidnapping Fatima, which ultimately led to Smiley being reborn. Here's the key point. If Elgin hadn't been there, they might have been able to solve Fatima's problem, or at least delay the pregnancy. Smiley was born so quickly because Fatima drank Elgin's blood, which strengthened the baby. If she had starved herself, it likely would have taken much longer. Sarah told Boyd and Ellis that the voices were laughing, that they knew they wouldn't find Fatima in time. That phrasing is very important. They wouldn't find Fatima in time. And we saw that this was true. They only found her after she gave birth. But if the voices said that, it suggests that if they had found her in time, they might have been able to stop or reverse the pregnancy. The point I'm trying to make is this. If Elgin is Toby's replacement, then the voices may have been right about killing him. And if that's true, they could also be right about Ethan. This ties directly into the theory that Ethan is the man in yellow. So the real question becomes, what if the voices were right all along? So far, everything they've said has come true. 2 cars arriving in town, Nathan dying if Sarah didn't act, and even Sarah and Boyd surviving in the forest. Everything the voices have done seems to push events in a specific direction. Based on the outcomes of Sarah's actions, even the terrible ones, there have been results that move the story forward. So here's my question. Could the voices be right when they say that the way to get home is by killing the boy? Let me know what you think in the comments, because I truly believe this deserves a deeper analysis. Another thing that keeps bothering me is how the monsters seem to know everything about the people trapped there. I'm sure that once we get a full explanation of the town, it will also explain how the monsters are so knowledgeable. But for now, it remains a huge mystery. I've also always wondered if the talismans would work inside a locked room. We saw that when the monsters entered the colony house, Ellis and Fatima were safe in the entryway. That made me think. Technically, it's the same concept. So if monsters manage to enter a house, could you still stop them by locking your bedroom door and placing a talisman inside? I'm really curious about this. In episode 9 of season 1, when Tabitha has her first vision of the lighthouse, we can see Ethan's toy there. Considering how much emphasis is placed on Norman, as well as the many references to the Chromonocle and the Lake of Tears, Norman's presence there doesn't feel random at all. We can also hear a ship outside, which is very interesting, because the lighthouse is in the middle of the forest, and we haven't seen any body of water close enough for a ship horn to be heard. We hear that same ship horn again, after Boyd and Sarah's tent is dragged through the woods. Another interesting detail from Tabitha's vision is that she sees Jim hanged. I mention this because there's a popular theory in the fandom that Jim will eventually be found hanged like that in the barn. Moving forward, there's another important piece of dialogue from Ethan. This might not be as surprising since we already know it, but it's still worth mentioning. When Julie brings Victor's drawings and they try to make sense of them, she says, "Ethan thinks it's a puzzle." To which Ethan immediately responds, "No, not a puzzle, a story. They all fit together and tell a story. And once we figure out the story, we'll know what to do next. We can't finish the quest unless we figure out the story." Ethan also says, "There are drawings of scarecrows and bogeymen and giant spiders. This is definitely a quest." This is important because based on the Season 4 trailer, we see that a new scarecrow monster will appear. I believe the bogeymen Ethan refers to are the creatures that come out at night, or possibly even the man in yellow. This also suggests that we might see giant spiders, and as I mentioned earlier, there's a strong chance that those spiders could be the final villains of the story. The last thing I want to discuss from Season 1 is the conversation between Boyd and Sarah in the tent, when Sarah hears the voice of a woman saying she was wrong. That woman turns out to be Abby, Boyd's deceased wife, who says she was wrong, meaning she shouldn't have guided Boyd into the woods. The key takeaway here is that the voices don't seem to be all-knowing. Moving on to Season 2, the first thing that caught my attention is the suitcase Tabitha finds in the underground tunnel. That suitcase looks very similar to the one the man in yellow has in the trailer. We also see the man in yellow changing form, and at one point we notice blonde hair. Could he be transforming into a woman? This becomes even more interesting when we remember that Tabitha found a white dress inside that suitcase. Victor also mentions that the monsters like to collect personal belongings from the people they kill. When the bus arrives in town, we see Elgin having seizures. So far, the only other characters we've seen having seizures are Ethan and Sarah. Later, in Season 3, Julie also has a seizure when she steps into the tower ruins and story walks for the first time. Based on this pattern, it seems safe to assume that these seizures indicate a connection to the town, and they occur when the place is trying to communicate with someone. Next, the construction puzzle Ethan is making at the colony house is identical to what Tabitha saw in the tunnels when the children first appeared. We also see the children appear again after Ethan completes the puzzle. Now, this next detail is very interesting, and I completely missed it on my first watch. In Season 2, Episode 2, when the bus passengers are trapped inside the diner, Randall takes Kenny hostage in order to make them open the door. Kenny manages to escape because someone knocks on the window. On my first watch, I assumed it was the monsters. But here's the interesting part. What if it wasn't the monsters, and it was actually Julie story walking? Julie was inside the diner. She saw everything. And if it were the monsters, why was there only one knock? Why didn't they say anything? We've seen them talk to people to lure them into opening doors, but this time there was only a single knock and complete silence. That's why I think it might have been Julie. Moving forward after Boyd gets infected by Martin and leaves the tower, the first thing he sees in the woods is the dog. But this time, the dog does something unusual. It approaches Boyd and smells him. Why? Could the dog sense what was inside Boyd? Could it recognize the worms? With Elgin's arrival, we also see that the voices can communicate with multiple people, not just Sarah. But this raises an important question. Are the voices speaking to Elgin the same ones speaking to Sarah? We've been assuming that the voices guiding Sarah might actually be helping people. But maybe a better question is the kimono lady one of those voices? Or is she something entirely different? The voices seem to help the town through Elgin as well, especially when he remembers the nursery rhyme from his dream. So what do you think? Are there two types of voices, one good and one bad, just like we have the boy in white and the man in yellow? Or are all the voices good and Elgin was tricked by the kimono lady? Honestly, I think the kimono lady is also one of the voices, especially because of the promise she makes to Elgin, that everyone will go home. That promise is very similar to what the voices told Sarah. So, in the end, I lean toward the idea that there are two types of voices, one good and one bad. One thing I kept wondering while rewatching the show is how people arrived in the town before cars were invented. Based on the years shown in the lighthouse, it seems like the first cycle started around 1506. I mean, if people were traveling by horse and saw a tree in the middle of the road, couldn't they just go around it, especially if they didn't have a carriage? Or does seeing the tree mean it's already game over, and no matter which direction you go, you still end up in the town? Moving forward to the first meeting between Elgin and Sarah. At first it seemed like a random encounter, but in From, nothing is random. Especially when we consider that they are the only two people who can hear the voices. Maybe the voices were the ones who guided Elgin to the church so he could meet Sarah. In their dialogue, we even get a bit of foreshadowing that Elgin might be corrupted by the voices. Sarah tells him, "You are sweet," which is the exact same phrasing Tabitha used to describe Sarah when she was playing with Ethan. In episode 5, when Jade and Victor make their deal, Jade plays a lullaby in exchange for information about the symbol. Victor tells him, "Everyone died when Christopher started seeing that symbol. At night, everyone died. My mother told me to hide somewhere new, somewhere Christopher didn't know about. When I woke up the next morning, everyone was dead." There are bad things here. They make people do bad things. Now, I know that the symbol is believed to represent the hope of the sacrificed children, but as Jim said, we should question everything. What if the symbol is actually something bad? I say this because when Jade barges into Victor's room with Ethan and starts talking about the symbol, Ethan responds, "Symbols are important in a quest, but you must first determine if it's a good symbol or a bad symbol. Also, every time Jade sees the symbol, it's associated with blood." So yes, the symbol is important for understanding the story, but based on Victor's account, it also seems to trigger the chain of events that leads to the massacre. If Victor hid somewhere Christopher didn't know about, and he was the only survivor, could that mean that the one who killed everyone wasn't the man in yellow, but Christopher himself? I don't believe that the man in yellow was the one who killed everyone during Victor's childhood cycle. In that cycle, the boy in white made a mistake. He even admits it to Victor later when Victor tries to cut down the bottle tree and the boy in white stops him. Victor asks why he didn't help them. Weren't they friends? Why didn't he save them? And the boy in white replies that he tried, but they needed to learn things on their own. This is where the boy in white failed. He was impatient and told Christopher too much about the children and everything else before Christopher was ready. That's why the cycle failed. In From, everything has an order. You can't rush it. It's like a game. You can't move to the next level until you're ready. If you rush, you won't be strong enough, and you'll fail. I think that in earlier cycles, the boy in white waited, but people couldn't figure things out. That's why, in Miranda's cycle, he intervened, hoping to change the outcome. He told Christopher what needed to be done, but Christopher didn't believe him. That's why Victor told his mother everything he heard, which led Miranda to go to the tower. The conclusion here is that Miranda and Christopher didn't figure things out on their own. They didn't remember, they were told, and that's a huge difference. Everything in From exists for a reason. Tabitha's childhood nightmares, the bottle tree, the faraway tree, everything. And if you don't follow the correct order, you die. As Ethan said at the end of Season 1 when Victor was missing, Everyone has a role to play. We can see that when people try to rush things, bad outcomes follow. Dale is the perfect example. He went through the same tree as Tabitha, but instead of reaching the lighthouse, he ended up stuck in the pool wall. When Boyd and Sarah went through the same tree at the end of season 1, they ended up in different places because they were needed in different locations to move the story forward. Boyd needed to reach the tower. Based on everything we've analyzed so far, Miranda and Christopher didn't play the melody. And if they didn't play the song, then the man in yellow wouldn't have been released. That's why I believe he wasn't the one who killed everyone. Christopher, or possibly another entity, might have been responsible. The last question I have about that cycle is, why did it end? Shouldn't it have continued as long as someone was still alive? Victor survived, so shouldn't the cycle have continued until he died as well? Maybe Victor is an anomaly, and that's why this story might have a different ending. Remember when Ethan told Julie, "You can only see a chapter, you can't change it. And once the story is finished, it cannot be changed." The children's story ended a long time ago, and it didn't have a happy ending. Based on the rules we understand so far, a story can't be changed. But maybe Victor, as an anomaly, is the one thing that can change it. Or maybe the people in the town don't matter as much as we think. Maybe the only ones who truly matter are the original parents, the ones connected to the children. Maybe they are the only ones who can finish the story. And if both of them die, the cycle ends and their reincarnations take their place. Maybe they're also the only ones who can go through the faraway tree and reach the lighthouse. Hopefully, Season 4 will answer some of these questions, because right now there are too many possibilities. I can't even say with certainty who the true main characters are. I know Tabitha is one, but what about the others? Jade? Boyd? Ethan? Okay, going back to my rewatch. The next thing that made me question things is Fatima's baby. We learn that Fatima is pregnant after Boyd kills Smiley, and eventually Smiley is reborn as Fatima's baby. But here's the question. Fatima was already pregnant before Boyd killed Smiley. So what would have happened if Boyd never killed him? Or maybe, as we said before, the story is already written and can't be changed, and it was always known that Smiley would die. Still, I think this is important and worth analyzing. For example, what if Boyd had passed the worms to Kenny instead? What would have happened then? That would be a very interesting what-if scenario. Also, on my second watch, when I looked more closely at the kimono lady, she kind of resembles Fatima, don't you think? Another interesting detail that I don't see many people talking about is the conversation between Sarah and Kevin, where Sarah mentions that her brother had a theory about the place, and that Nathan was afraid of cicadas. Nathan's theory was that the fears of the people who die are absorbed by the forest. That could explain why Sarah believes the cicadas are connected to Nathan. The last thing I want to discuss about Season 2 is the final scene, when the boy in white pushes Tabitha out of the lighthouse, telling her, "It's the only way." Why was that necessary? Was the purpose to bring Acosta or Henry into the town? Because right now I can't clearly see the reason. The only other reason is that Tabitha learns Miranda had visions of the place before she arrived there. However, I'm not sure how important that is, since Miranda later realizes she had been dreaming about that place long before arriving. Let me know in the comments what you think the real reason was for Tabitha being sent back to the real world. Now, moving on to Season 3, my first question was, how can the boy in white appear in the real world? And if he can do that, does that mean the man in yellow can also appear there? My second question is about the priest Miranda wanted to confess to. He seemed a bit suspicious, especially the way he asked about the lunchbox. It was at that exact moment that Tabitha realized Victor's address was inside it. Everything felt too perfectly timed to be just a random encounter. Another question I have, and again, I haven't seen many people discuss this, is Father Khatri really just a manifestation created by Boyd's mind? Or is there something more going on? Could he be one of the voices just appearing in a different form? At first, I thought he was simply part of Boyd's imagination, a kind of moral anchor. But one line of dialogue made me question that. When Boyd talks about seeing Abby before smashing the music box, and how that might have been the town trying to stop him, he asks Father Khatri, "What are you?" And Khatri responds, "I'm afraid I can't answer that for you, Boyd." That's a surprisingly vague and mysterious answer. Maybe I'm overanalyzing, but these apparitions always appear at the most critical moments in Boyd's life. We could also assume that Tom might be a similar kind of voice appearing to Jade. So what do you think? Are these just psychological projections, or something much deeper connected to the town. The main question I had about Season 3 was about the monsters and why they didn't kill Boyd. I know the common theory that the forest feeds on hope and the monsters want to break Boyd psychologically. But is that really all there is to it? What if it's something more? So far, we've seen the monsters spare both Boyd and Randall. The explanation given in the show is that they wanted Randall to serve as a visual reminder that no one is truly safe. Seeing him during the day reinforces the horror of what awaits at night. But what if the monsters didn't spare Boyd and Randall by choice? What if they couldn't kill them? Think about it, this actually makes a lot of sense. We saw that the monsters were afraid of the ballerina. When the music starts playing in the RV, they freeze completely. Martin also said that the monsters are just the tip of the spear, and that there are far more terrifying things in the woods. This suggests a hierarchy, and that the town's monsters are at the bottom. So maybe the reason they spared Boyd and Randall is because they were claimed by something higher in that hierarchy? Something connected to the tower. Maybe the monsters weren't allowed to kill them. Or maybe they simply can't. Randall himself says something very similar to what Martin said, that there are things worse than dying, and that's exactly what the tower seems to do to him. So could it be that once someone is infected or touched by the tower, they're no longer under the monster's control? I know it sounds far-fetched, but can we really say there's no evidence supporting this? Next, let's talk about a few interesting details. First, Boyd's plan in episode 3 to trap a monster inside a house using a talisman. In theory, it sounds smart, but we've already seen that this wouldn't work. When the monsters ambush Boyd and Tian Chen in the barn, Boyd locks the door and places a talisman on it. But by morning, only Boyd is left inside. That means the monsters were able to open the door despite the talisman being there. So realistically, Boyd's plan would have failed. Another small detail, we see Randall crafting a wooden figure that closely resembles the totems found in the woods. That can't be a coincidence. Moving on to episode 4, when Ethan answers the phone and Thomas speaks to him about the ambulance. When Jim takes the phone, he says, "Leave my children alone." And the voice responds, "They are not your children anymore." What does that mean? I believe this line could be extremely important for understanding the deeper mystery of the town. When Victor tells Sarah about the people from his first cycle, he mentions that the boy in white told him that if he couldn't bury all the bodies, he should at least collect personal items and bury those instead. This becomes very interesting when we consider the theory that the man in yellow might be able to transform into different people, and that he could use personal belongings to do so. If that's true, then the boy in white asking Victor to collect and bury those items could actually be a way of countering the man in yellow. In my trailer analysis, I said that the Scarecrow monster might be connected to the totem Jade broke in Season 3, allowing the monsters to attack the cabins. But after rewatching, I think I was wrong. They spent a full night in the cabins after the totems were broken, and nothing happened. So there must be another reason why the Scarecrow creature is able to attack them. Another mystery is the bear trap that caught Christie. Why was it even there? What were they trying to catch? It doesn't seem like it was meant for the town monsters. Maybe it was intended for something else. The unknown creatures we hear in the forest at night. Now this next idea is really interesting. When Julie and Ethan go to the tower ruins, Julie crosses the threshold and reaches the place where she, Randall, and Marielle were held. What if this is the moment when Julie gained the ability to story walk? I've always wondered why she's the only one who can do it. Is it because she's Tabitha's daughter? Or because she was physically chained in that place? If that's the case, could Randall and Marielle eventually gain the same ability? After connecting this with the trailer, I think it's safe to say that the tower ruins act as a threshold, a gateway Julie must pass through to access different parts of the story. I believe that in Season 4, she'll start mastering this ability. Now here's something even more important. Ethan says that you can only view chapters of the story, you can't change them. But we've already seen that this isn't entirely true. Julie did change the story. She was the one who threw Boyd the rope. And if we're right that she was also the one who knocked on the window in Season 2, then that's two separate instances where she altered events. Which means she can change the story. Julie throwing the rope to Boyd is a perfect example of the grandfather paradox. If Julie didn't throw the rope, Boyd wouldn't have escaped the tower. If Boyd hadn't escaped, he wouldn't have destroyed the music box. And if he hadn't destroyed the music box, Julie wouldn't have survived. So Julie only exists in that moment because Boyd already saved her. If she fails to act, she erases her own future. So based on this, she absolutely can influence the story. Another question, how did Martin know Julie's name immediately? Could it be because Julie had already story-walked into the past and met him when he was still a resident of the town? Another detail I noticed on Rewatch is in episode 9, when Fatima is locked up and the kimono lady appears, forcing her to stay silent. At the same time, the children guide Tabitha to the root cellar, where Fatima is trapped. If the kimono lady hadn't stopped Fatima from screaming, she would have been rescued before giving birth. Instead, Tabitha assumes the children led her there to find Victor, but that wasn't the real reason. The children were actually trying to stop Smiley from being reborn. Surprisingly, these are all my questions and observations from Season 3. When I first started this rewatch, I expected Season 3 to be the most packed, but apparently not. Maybe it's because many questions were already answered, or maybe we've just become more familiar with the story. One last thing I found funny. When Jim, Tabitha, and Jade are at the bar trying to figure out the song, Jim tells them to stop because it's dangerous. And Jade responds, "How can playing a song harm us?" Which is ironic, because the song is exactly what leads to Jim's death. It's what allows the man in yellow to appear. Hopefully you enjoyed this video even if the format was a bit unusual. I also hope my questions and observations made you see the show in a different light, and maybe even gave you new ideas for your own theories. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'm really looking forward to analyzing this show together with you.